Okay, so I hope everyone had a nice long weekend, and we're going to get started. So I think we should, because it's so much time has happened, let's start the sif again. Hamalves chavero, that when you lend someone money, lo yalvenu elo b'fnei edim, right? So this is just a review, because we saw this whole sif already, that when you lend someone money, you should only lend the money in front of witnesses. Afilu haloivehu talmud chacham, even if the love is a scholar. Ubevadai lo yichbor midaito. Excuse me. And you know for sure that he would never deny owing you the money if he was of the right mind. You still have to worry that maybe he'll forget that the loan was ever made. Machmas tirdas limudo, because he's like, the absent-minded professor. He's so involved in his learning that he just might have forgotten. V'yachborbo, b'chol hamalva below edim, over mishum lifnei iver lo sitain michshol. That if you lend money without witnesses, you're in violation of lifnei iver. Ela imkein hilveu ala mashka, unless you lend him money with collateral, because in that situation, if the guy simply forgets or denies owing you the money, you can say, okay, I'm just going to keep the mashkon then, okay? The afal pichein, and even then, amalva bishtar mishubach yoter shebemashkon, because mishubach yoter. But nonetheless, lending with a promissory note is always better. Why? Shebemashkon efshe sheyishkach halo v'sachalva. He says, because when you have just collateral, maybe the collateral is worth more than the loan, and people will forget, especially the borrower will forget how much the loan was for. And then he'll say, but my collateral is worth much more. And then you say, no, it's not. And then you'll get into a conflict. So it's much better to always have a piece of paper that records the amount of the loan. And furthermore, having a piece of paper also resolves an issue that even if there were witnesses, maybe the witnesses will not be available. Maybe they'll be out of town, and you'll have that problem as well. So that's the halacha that we already saw, and we had just started the Imrei Yaakov on this halacha. So what the first thing that we saw in the Imrei Yaakov is that even when you lend someone money with witnesses, why should that help? Don't you have isn't there the possibility that the guy will say, yeah, I borrowed the money from you, but I paid you back? So when you have a promissory note, the promissory note in the hands of a lender is the strongest evidence, because once a person pays back a loan, the creditor has to surrender the promissory note or tear it up in the presence of the borrower. But if it's just done with edim, we know that a guy could say, of course, I'm not going to deny that I borrowed the money, but I paid you back. So he says that af be'edim ein lahalvos ela b'derech shelo yehi b'yado lomer paraiti kagon shomer lo al tifreini ela b'fnei ploni uplan. That in front of witnesses, when you lend them the money, you say, do not pay me back unless it's in front of these same witnesses, so that you make that condition when the money is lent with witnesses. Bifnei edim, in front of witnesses. Ayin lekaman the hamalvis chavero be'edim lo yichtavu edusam v'yitnu lamalvis shalom midas halova ayin sham. We'll see later on that if it's done with witnesses without paper, the witnesses do not have permission to write down in paper that the loan was made, and we'll see why that is in the next chapter. Okay. And then we learned the Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan had told us something that Rav Stern wasn't so happy with. He says, when people know each other, and it's there's a gemach and they know each other, and they trust each other that they're not going to forget, so then you don't need to do it in front of witnesses. And as we saw in In the Biurim, the Rav Stern was not so happy with that. He says, because he quotes from a Gemara that Ravina didn't want to lend money unless there were witnesses present, even though he was lending money to Rav Ashi. So we see even people that are very good friends should not be lending money without witnesses. And the conclusion that he came to in this long piece is that when it's something, a small amount, that you're willing to even forgive if the guy never pays you back, that's permitted to be done without witnesses, without paper. So I go over to my neighbor and I ask to borrow a cup of sugar. We don't have to pull up a shtar. We don't have to call witnesses to come over and testify that this was done, because you know what? We both understand that in the event that I forget to give you back the cup of sugar that I borrowed, or the $10 that I borrow, to cover the bill, right? So then we both know that we'll be mochel. Right. Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Anyway, so let us continue in the Imrei Yaakov. Machmas tirdas limudo. He says sometimes a person, you lend money to a Talmud Chacham, he has this absent-mindedness to him and he might forget. Uvegemara muchach deitzel talmidei chachamim matzui hashichacha beinyan ze yoser mistam adam. The Gemara seems to indicate that this is a common trait among talmidei chachamim more so than with other people. Now, what does that Gemara say? Let's just take a quick look at the Gemara. But ayin hey amid beis, bava mitzia, ayin hey amid beis. It's not. There we go. Bava mitzia. Ayin hey 75b. The Gemara over there is the Ela over and below Sasa. The following people violate a negative commandment if they lend money with interest. Okay, so that's really the topic. Talking about all of the different prohibitions involved in loans. So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Kol mi sheyesh lo mos umalva osan shelo be'edim, anyone who has money and lends it without witnesses, over mishom belifnei iver lo sitein michshol. And Reish Lakish says, Gorim klala la'atzma, and he causes a curse to happen to him. Gemara relates an incident. The sages said to Rav Ashi, Ravina fulfills all of the directives that the sages say, seeking to test him. Rav Ashi sent a message to him close to sunset on the eve of Shabbos, at the busiest time of the week, with the following request: let the master send me 10 dinars as a loan, as I have happened upon a small piece of land for an acquisition and I need the money. Ravina sent a message to him: let the master bring witnesses and we will write a written document for this loan. Rav Ashi sent a message to him: even I as well. Do you suspect me of shirking payment? Ravina sent a message to him: all the more so is it necessary to document a loan to the master, who is occupied with his studies and therefore very likely to forget, and I will thereby bring a curse upon us. So in other words, he was basically saying, you are more occupied with your studies. You're not a worldly man. You're not involved in the matters of this world. You're involved with spiritual affairs. And therefore, rabbis tend to forget things that are involve financial issues more readily than the rest of the population. Okay, so mishum v'lifnei iver, right? That you violate lifnei iver. So Yeah, I mean, so there's a stereotype of the absent-minded rabbi, the absent-minded professor, but it's the Gemara actually documents it. Okay, Mishum v'lifnei iver v'chulei, sha'ola al rucho shalo v'lichbor b'halva. That you give, in other words, what is the lifnei iver? What is the fact? Lifnei iver says basically that you're causing another Jew to sin. How are you causing another Jew to sin? By lending him money without witnesses, because you're allowing the borrower to think that maybe I can deny it. He says, and also you're bringing a curse upon yourself, because when you ask the man to pay you back and he denies it, other people will curse you. And they're going to accuse you of falsely accusing another person who's righteous of not paying back his debts. You're just trying to extract money from him falsely. So, in other words, people are going to have a bad assessment of a creditor who tries to extract a debt without witnesses, because they're going to say, "Oh, you would accuse so and so of doing such a terrible thing." The kasvu kama poskin, the eitzel tamidei chachamim the mistamelo yichbar bo midaito lespe mishum lifnei iber lo sitin mechshol. Some poskim write that when it comes to a Talmud Chacham, who you know will not deny the loan, there's no reason to worry about lifnei iber. But umikol makom yesh lachush de machmas tirdaso tirdas limudo yishkachenu v'yishba she'eno chayiv. You still have to worry that because of his absent-mindedness due to his learning, that he's going to forget, and he may even swear that he doesn't owe the money when in reality he does. V'yigram hamal v'la'atzmo klala kanal, and that's in it not because of his desire to sin and to lie, but rather because of his absent-mindedness. You're going to cause a curse upon yourself. So even if you're not over on lifnei iver, because you're not causing the debtor to sin because he's not doing it maliciously, but even if he does it accidentally, you'll cause a curse to befall you. Now we know that even very pious people are not always so careful about this, and we went through this in the Biurim. He says, "Vayin bebiurim shekasav nusmach leminhag ha'olam dim haloiva talmid chacham afilu hu Yehudi pashut." He says, and therefore, we wrote in the Biurim that if the borrower is a talmid chacham or even a pashut yid, aval hamalva makiro betur adam hagun v'yirei shamayim, but the malva trusts him and acknowledges that he's a trustworthy, reliable person. De'inbo isser midina, that we can't say that his mamish and isser, gamim ha'alvahu lizman aroch, even if it's a long-term loan. V'imzel lizman katzar, but then he writes in the parentheses, umikol makom roi chadai bazel lichtav al kol panim shtar b'chasimas yadav. But at least you should write up a promissory note, just as a reminder, okay? V'imzel lizman katzar delek lamechash bazel l'shichacha. But if it's for a short period of time, and there's no reason to suspect that anyone will forget, ein bo gam mishum chashash kalala. Then you really don't have to worry about a curse. V'zeh omar gam b'sikum gadol. And that's true even if the amount of the loan is large. Avol b'davar muad shim lo yachzirenu yimchalo v'zeh shari gam la'am haaretz. And when it comes to small loans, so we said that even for a person who's not necessarily the most trustworthy person, he may not be such a Yirei Shamayim, but nonetheless, you can still do it without paper. And therefore, the minhag is to lend your neighbors small amounts of goods or commodities or money, even if they're not Talmidei Chachamim, even if they're not trustworthy people, because at the end of the day, you're going to be forgiving. And that's sort of like the defense of the statement of the Aruch HaShulchan, that today people are not so careful about this because they trust each other, and especially if the person's a Talmid Chacham, you have a right to lend money, even without paper. But still, at the end of the day, if you want to make sure that none of this happens, it's always a good idea to have paper involved. It's really, really a good idea to have a simple piece of paper, scribble on a piece of paper. On such and such a date, I borrowed money from Plony, or on such and such a date, I lent money to Plony. You have the guy sign it, and you're done. And there's nothing untoward. You tell him, I'm doing both of us a favor in case one of us forgets. We have a record, and don't worry about it. I'm just putting it in the drawer. Whenever you have the opportunity to pay me back, you'll pay me back. Okay. Now, on the issue of Lifnei Iver, he has a long piece. Wow, this is a very long piece. But let's just see what his shaila is. Because the whole issue of Lifnei Iver is a very complicated sugya. When you're over on Lifnei Iver and when you're not. We know that there's a concept in halacha that there's a Lifnei Iver de oraisa and a Lifnei Iver de rabbanan. Lifnei Iver de oraisa is when it's trei avri de nahara. It's when the only way that the guy can sin is through your assistance. And when he can sin without your assistance, but you assist him nonetheless, then there's a Lifnei Iver de rabbanan. You're not over on it de oraisa. Istapakti baha de kaimelan, the hamoshi kos yain lenazir, the over mishum Lifnei Iver lo sitein michshal, hechi de koi betray avri de nahara. He says, my question is as follows. We know from the Gemara that if you give a cup of wine to a nazir to drink, so you're over on Lifnei Iver in a situation where his accessibility to wine only comes through you. And in that situation, it's called Trei Avri Denahara. It literally, that term means two sides of the river. In other words, the only way for that guy to do the Aveira is to get across the river, and you have the only ferry that can take him across the river. So if you take him across the river, and he sins as a result of you taking him across the river, you're over on Lifnei Iver. Similarly, if he doesn't have access to wine, you're the only guy in the vicinity that has wine, and you give him a glass of wine. So then that's called Trei Avri Denahara, and you're over on Lifnei Iver. Ha'im kishemoshe lo me'atzmo b'liba kashas hanazir. Ve'ein b'daita v'kavanasu sheyishta ela kavanasu liros im hanazir yavar avera olo ha'im shari lasos kain. He says, what if you would give a nazir a glass of wine? It's not your intention that he should drink it, but you want to test him to see if he will stick to his Nazirism or not. Are you permitted to do that? Is it permitted to tempt someone to sin in that kind of scenario? The suffix says shayach gam im ninko kashita sayat malachi shekasa bazev and mistapakma b'limud hayeshiva echa shahanazir lo shasa oso kos shel yain. Because the question from the Yad Malachi, which is a later commentary, he says, what would be the din if you give a glass of wine to a nazir and he ends up not drinking the wine? Or another example of Lifnei Iver, which applies to Gentiles as well, is what if you give a piece of Aver min hachai, which is prohibited to a Gentile, a limb from a living animal, and you give it to a Gentile and he ends up not eating it. Have you been over on Lifnei Iver just by doing the act, even when he didn't end up doing the Aveira? Onema came in the sof who nasan hamichshol lifneihem over belav lifnei Iver lo sitem michshol after lo nichshaluba. He says, is the Isser of Lifnei Iver dependent upon his succumbing to sin? Or even if he doesn't do the sin, have I been over on Lifnei Iver just tempting him to sin by or allowing him to sin? V'hinei be'emes u'v'tamim b'koach hasvara amarti d'mikol makom ka'avar hamoshit af shelo bo al yado lidei michshol Kivin the Anasina Kapid Rahmana Bahari Nasan, And so the Ad Malachi says, it would seem to me from logic alone that the whole Isser is giving him the glass of wine. Whether or not he chooses to drink it or not is irrelevant to the fact that, and when you think about it, that's what the term words of the Torah is. Do not place a stumbling block in front of a blind person. What if the blind person manages to avoid the stumbling block that you put in front of him? It's still usher, just by the fact that you put the stumbling block in front of him. Okay. Okay.
How educated they are in talking about but I don't even think non-Jews know.
Yeah. So, all right. So, I mean, especially if he doesn't know about it, it could certainly be problematic. But even if let's say he knows about it, you're right. But you're right. Giving him something that he doesn't even know is prohibited will also be a problem. I was just skipping a few lines. He says, "Davar zen nafkamina gamle in yenochi sherotza lekablo la'avoda, v'rotza lenasosa imu ish hagun." Classic situation. You hire, let's say, Matilda as your housekeeper, and you want to test if she's trustworthy. So what do? So umevakesh lasim lo sikum ma'ot beveto b'tzad b'pina. You leave some money out on the dresser to see if Matilda will be trustworthy or not. Amanas ladas im hanochu yishlach yodo b'mosalo. V'harei gam b'nochu ika lifnei iver. K'disa b'gemara b'razar sham daf bava medbeis. We know that there's an isser of lifnei iver even for Gentiles, as it says in the Gemara. Minayin shelo yoshid adam kos shel yain lenazir ve'ever min achai livnei Noach. Gemara gives two examples of lifnei iver, giving a glass of wine to a nazir and aver min hachai to a non-Jew. Okay, Talmud Omer v'lifnei iver lo sitein michshol. He says, and the Shulchan Aruch cites Ramah, which he says in the brackets that it is forbidden to sell idolatry items to a non-Jew, right? Because that's also lifnei iver. If you're facilitating avodah zarah, in other words, if let's say a guy's a Buddhist and he needs to buy Buddha statues to put over around his house, a Jew cannot be a purveyor of Buddha statues. If you hold that that's avodah zarah, I'm not saying definitively it is, but there's a good argument to be made that it is. You cannot sell Buddha statues or incense cans or things like that for churches and things like that.
There's a lot of Valley City that sell most of the stuff to non-Jews.
Yeah, well, I don't know if a crucifix by itself is avodah zarah. I know that there might be some poskim who are machmer, but I don't think you have to be machmer if you're selling just a crucifix. That in itself is not avodah zarah, even if people kiss their crucifix. It's like people kissing a mezuzah, right? It's not. I think even if he's hanging from it, they recognize that's not their god. So it's a piece of jewelry. Yeah, I don't think that's avodah zarah. But the incense for the church or the shrine, or a Buddha statue perhaps would be avodah zarah. V'lichora yesh lifshot she'ilatenu misof perak ezev neshech, because we saw this Gemara a moment ago. Amar of Yehuda Marav, Kol mi sheyesh lo mos umalva osam shelo be'edim, over mishum v'lifnei iver lo sitein michshol, Reish Lakish Amar gorim klal la'atzma. The Gemara quotes two Amoraim. The first one says that if you lend money without witnesses, you're over on lifnei iver, and Reish Lakish says you cause a curse to befall yourself. And Amar le Rabbanan le Ravashi kamakayim ravina kol mada Amar Rabbanan. And then the story of Ravina and Ravashi. And Ravashi wanted to test Ravina. Remember that whole story we just saw a minute ago. Ravashi wanted to test Ravina. And so he basically said to him, I have an investment opportunity. Please lend me 10 dinars. And it was right before Shabbos. And Ravashi did it to see if Ravina was going to lend money the right way by drawing up paper. So, Umashma mizel lechora, deshari lenasot adam kidei lirot ha'im hu mekayim mitzvahs Hashem. It seems from that whole story that it's permitted to test a person to see if he's fulfilling the halacha. That's what it sounds like from the story, because, right? If you just go back to the story for 1 second, Ravina, the sages said to Ravashi, Ravina fulfills all the directives of the sages, seeking, and they fill in the Steinsaltz Gemara, seeking to test him. Ravashi sent a messenger to him close to sunset on the eve of Shabbat at the busiest time of the week with the following request. Let the master send me 10 dinars as a loan, as I have happened upon a small piece of land for an acquisition and I need the money. Okay, so there's clearly a test going on over here. Okay, so how do we deal with that? Okay, Mikol Makom Holver Ravashi Ratza Rak L'Nasoto L'Chein Bo Isser Lifnei Iver. He says it seems therefore that there's no Lifnei Iver there because he didn't really want him to do the Aveira. He just wanted to test him to see if he would follow through. Amnam Hayef Shalitchot V'Lomar D'Shani Hasam D'Mari Ba'Aveira D'Rabbanan. But maybe not so. It's not such a easy thing to adduce from there, because it's really only a halacha d'Rabbanan over there. The sphere leila Ravashi d'Isser halva b'li edim eno midioraisa v'lachem lo chash lazeh. Maybe Ravashi felt that it was only a rabbinical law, which is the implication from the Gemara that Ravina fulfills all the words of the rabbis. Good morning. Come on. It's okay. Are we good for today? What? Oh, we haven't set anything up. He's just going to call me.
Okay.
Thank you. But everything seems fine. But thank you. Thank you for checking in. I appreciate it. Okay. Okay. Aval be'emet de'ein bazem mishum dichoy. Rak le'elu de lo sfir le'kamin chaschinoch. Al v'yeshnam harbe tiskimu l'mashakasa min chaschinoch mitzvah shlam beis the gambis de rabbanon ika mishum lifnei iver deoraisa. But the Minchas Chinuch writes that there is a lifnei iver even for rabbinic law. So if there's a lifnei iver even for rabbinic law, then you would be able to adduce from that story in the Gemara that you are allowed to test someone by giving them the opportunity to sin, even when it's not your intention, as long as it's not your intention that they actually sin. The minhag ha'olam de mekilim v'nogim lahalvos b'li eidem mishum d'spir le'dikar hatamu mishum d'gorim klal la'atzmoch v'reish lakisham mishul lachash lezeh shari v'ravashi nam spir le'hachi v'lachein lachash le'inu l'shal lifnei iver. It could also be that Ravashi was not worried about lifnei iver. He held like Reish Lakish, who said that it's not an issue of lifnei iver, but just that you're causing a curse to befall you. Okay. Yeah. Well, the Rav Shulchan Aruch had said that it's a lifnei iver. That's your over on lifnei iver. That's right. But is he machmir? Right? Is he fulfilling the words of the rabbis? So there's different ways of interpreting the story in the Gemara. Would it have been an actual isser for him to lend the money without witnesses, without paper, or would it just have been a chumrah, like you're suggesting, or would it have just been a fear of getting a curse? And if you're not worried about the curse, then you're allowed to do it. So these are all different permutations of the question, and so perhaps you cannot adduce anything from there. We will get to the final analysis because I would like to know if I can leave money on the dresser and test Matilda. And that's something And that's something that we'll try and figure out in Mitzvah Shem tomorrow. Okay, we'll hold it here.